The evening sun cast long shadows through the windows of the Golden Fork, creating a warm glow across the crisp white tablecloths. For Maya Chen, it was just another Friday night juggling plates and managing customer demands. At 28, she wasn't your typical law student. Most of her classmates came straight from undergraduate programs, their parents still funding their education. But Maya's path had been different, and she wouldn't have it any other way. The restaurant buzzed with the usual weekend crowd. Business people unwinding after a long week, couples celebrating special occasions, and the regular crowd of wealthy locals who treated the Golden Fork as their second dining room. Maya adjusted her black apron, quickly checking her reflection in one of the polished serving trays. Her dark hair was neatly tied back, her uniform pristine despite having already worked 6 hours of her double shift. "Table 12 needs more bread," called out Rick, the aging bartender who'd become something of a father figure to the staff. He'd been at the Golden Fork longer than anyone else and knew every regular customer by name, along with their quirks and stories. Maya grabbed a fresh basket of warm soda, expertly weaving between tables while maintaining her professional smile. Law textbooks and case studies filled her mind even as she worked. She'd been studying during her break, preparing for Monday's mock trial. The weight of her student loans pressed heavily on her shoulders, but every tip brought her closer to her dream of becoming a civil rights attorney. The kitchen doors swung open with a burst of heat and noise. "2 prime ribs for table 15, announced Chef Lee, his voice carrying over the clatter of pots and pans. Maya loved how the kitchen staff moved like a well-orchestrated dance, each person knowing their role perfectly. It reminded her of her own family's restaurant back home, before the recession had forced them to sell. Just then, the front doors opened, letting in a blast of cool evening air. Maya's heart sank as she recognized the commanding figure who entered, Mrs. Victoria Blackwood. The woman's reputation for making servers' lives miserable was legendary among the staff. Her designer clothes probably cost more than Maya's entire semester's tuition, and her attitude made it clear she knew it. Victoria wasn't alone. She swept in with her usual entourage, 3 equally well-dressed women who seemed to exist solely to echo her opinions and laugh at her jokes. They were regulars too, but everyone knew Victoria was the queen bee. Their weekly dinner visits had already resulted in 2 servers quitting and another being fired after Victoria complained to the owner. "Heads up," Rick muttered as he passed by with a tray of martinis. "The Dragon Lady brought her own wine again. You know that's against policy." Maya nodded, taking a deep breath. She'd handled difficult customers before. It was part of the job. But Victoria Blackwood was in a league of her own. The woman had a talent for finding fault in everything from water temperature to the angle of her fork. What made tonight different was that Maya was covering for Jen, the server who usually handled Victoria's section. Jen had called in sick, and Maya needed the extra tips too badly to pass up the shift. Still, as she watched Victoria arrange herself at her favorite table like a queen holding court, Maya couldn't shake the feeling that this evening was about to become much more interesting than usual. She straightened her shoulders, remembering her old instructor's words. "It's not about the hand you're dealt, it's how you play it." Those words had gotten her through tough times before, through long nights of study, through doubts about her career change, through moments when giving up seemed easier than pushing forward. The evening light continued to fade outside, and the restaurant's elegant sconces created intimate pools of light throughout the dining room. Maya grabbed her order pad and pen, put on her most professional smile, and approached Victoria's table. Whatever happened next, she was ready to handle it with grace and professionalism. Little did she know that this ordinary Friday night was about to become anything but ordinary, and that her encounter with Victoria Blackwood would soon turn into one of the most talked-about incidents in the Golden Fork's history. Maya approached Victoria Blackwood's table with the practiced ease of someone who'd spent years in the service industry. The closer she got, the more obvious it became that Victoria had indeed brought her own bottle of wine, an expensive Bordeaux that was definitely not from the Golden Fork's wine list. The bottle sat half empty on the table, its label catching the light from the overhead chandeliers. "Good evening, ladies. Welcome to the Golden Fork. I'm Maya, and I'll be taking care of you tonight." Her voice was warm and professional, exactly as she'd learned during her first waitressing job at 16. Victoria barely glanced up from her phone, her perfectly manicured fingers tapping away at the screen. "Where's Jennifer?" Victoria's question came out sharp and demanding. She finally looked up, her eyes narrowing as she studied Maya's face. "She always serves us on Fridays." "Jennifer's out sick tonight," Maya explained smoothly. "But I assure you, I'll make sure you have an excellent dining experience." She pulled out her order pad, ready to take their drink orders, but Victoria wasn't finished. "Well, since you're new," Victoria's tone suggested this was a grave shortcoming, "I suppose I should tell you that we have very specific requirements. I want the water exactly at room temperature, not cold, not warm. Room temperature. And make sure the glasses are properly polished. Jennifer always checks them twice." Maya nodded professionally, though she noticed one of Victoria's friends looking slightly embarrassed by the demands. The youngest of the group, a woman in her early 30s wearing a designer blazer, kept glancing apologetically in Maya's direction. "Of course, Mrs. Blackwood. I'll ensure everything is to your liking." Maya's eyes moved to the wine bottle on the table. This was the tricky part. "I do need to mention, though, that state regulations and our restaurant policy don't allow outside beverages, including wine." The temperature at the table seemed to drop 10 degrees. Victoria's friends suddenly became very interested in their menus, while Victoria herself slowly put down her phone. Her expression reminded Maya of a storm cloud gathering strength. "Excuse me." Victoria's voice had that dangerous quality that entitled customers often got right before they exploded. "Do you know how much this bottle costs? It's worth more than you probably make in a week. Jennifer never had a problem with it." Maya kept her composure, drawing on years of experience handling difficult situations. "I understand, Mrs. Blackwood, and I apologize for any inconvenience. We have an excellent wine list I'd be happy to share with you. Perhaps I could suggest something similar to what you're enjoying." Victoria's face flushed slightly, the pink tinge clashing with her expensive makeup. "Do you know who I am? I've been coming here every Friday for 5 years. I'm personal friends with Mr. Peterson." She named the restaurant's owner, emphasizing each syllable. The other diners at nearby tables were starting to notice the tension. An elderly couple to the left had stopped eating entirely, their forks suspended in midair as they watched the scene unfold. Rick, the bartender, had positioned himself closer to the table, pretending to wipe down already clean glasses while keeping an eye on the situation. "Yes, Mrs. Blackwood, I know who you are," Maya replied calmly. "And because you are such a valued customer, I want to make sure we're following all regulations to provide you with the best possible service. Our wine list includes several excellent Bordeaux options that I believe you'd enjoy." One of Victoria's friends, the one in the blazer, tried to defuse the situation. "Maybe we should look at the wine list, Victoria. I've heard they've added some new selections." But Victoria wasn't having it. She lifted her wine glass deliberately, taking a long sip while maintaining eye contact with Maya. The challenge was clear. She was daring Maya to do something about it. Maya felt her law school training kicking in. She knew the restaurant could lose its liquor license if the wrong person noticed the outside wine. More importantly, she knew that backing down now would only encourage more rule-breaking in the future. The tension stretched like a rubber band pulled too tight. Other servers had started taking longer routes to their tables to avoid walking past the brewing confrontation. The kitchen staff, sensing trouble, began peeking through the service window. Even Chef Lee, usually absorbed in his cooking, had stepped closer to the door to listen. Maya took a quiet breath, centering herself. She'd faced worse situations during her previous career. She could handle one difficult customer, even if that customer was the notorious Victoria Blackwood. But as she opened her mouth to speak again, Victoria reached for the wine bottle, deliberately filling her glass to the brim while staring Maya down. The evening was about to take a turn that nobody in the Golden Fork could have predicted, and Maya's next words would set in motion a chain of events that would be talked about in restaurant circles for months to come. The kitchen doors swung open as 2 steaming plates of filet mignon made their way to Victoria Blackwood's table. Maya carried them with the precision of someone who'd balanced countless dishes over the years. The meat was supposed to be cooked medium rare, and Chef Lee had taken extra care with these particular steaks, knowing exactly who they were for. The restaurant had settled into its usual Friday night rhythm, the the soft clink of silverware mixing with gentle conversation and light jazz from the overhead speakers. But there was an undercurrent of tension that the regular customers could feel. Victoria's earlier confrontation about the wine had left a charged atmosphere that lingered like storm clouds before rain. "Your file at Mignon, ladies," Maya announced professionally, placing the perfectly arranged plates in front of Victoria and her friend in the designer blazer. The presentation was flawless. The meat scented precisely, the roasted vegetables arranged artistically, and the sauce drizzled with Chef Lee's signature flair. Victoria picked up her fork and knife with the air of a food critic about to deliver a harsh review. She cut into the steak with deliberate slowness, examining the interior with narrowed eyes. The meat was a beautiful rose color, exactly what you'd expect from a medium-rare preparation. But Victoria's face told a different story. "This is medium well," she declared, her voice carrying across the dining room. "I specifically ordered medium rare. Do you see this?" She gestured to her companions, who dutifully leaned in to examine the steak. "It's completely overcooked, ruined." Maya glanced at the steak, her experienced eye telling her it was cooked exactly as ordered. "I apologize if it's not to your liking, Mrs. Blackwood. Would you like me to have Chef Lee prepare another one for you?" "Chef Lee," Victoria scoffed, pushing her plate away. "Is he even a real chef? Because any real chef would know the difference between medium rare and this disaster." She took another long sip from her prohibited wine glass, her rings catching the light as she gestured dismissively. The young woman in the blazer cut into her own steak, which had been prepared exactly the same way. "Actually, Victoria, I think mine is perfect." "Maybe." "Nobody asked you, Lisa," Victoria snapped, causing her friend to fall silent immediately. The other two women at the table became intensely interested in their water glasses, clearly wanting to avoid becoming targets themselves. Maya maintained her professional demeanor, though she could feel her jaw tightening slightly. "I'll be happy to have the kitchen prepare a new steak for you, Mrs. Blackwood. Chef Lee has over 20 years of experience, and I'm sure he'll—" "I want to see the manager," Victoria interrupted, standing up so abruptly that her chair scraped loudly against the floor. Her silk scarf, probably worth more than Maya's monthly rent, fluttered dramatically as she rose. "Right now." "I apologize, but Mr. Chen, our manager, is currently handling an emergency situation in the back. He should be available in about 15 minutes if you'd like to." 15 minutes. Victoria's voice rose higher, drawing even more attention from nearby diners. "Do you have any idea who I am? Who I know in this city? I could have this entire restaurant shut down with one phone call." Maya took a careful breath, remembering her training in conflict resolution. "Mrs. Blackwood, I understand you're upset. I'm doing my best to resolve." The slap came out of nowhere. Victoria's hand moved so fast that Maya didn't even see it coming. The sound cracked through the restaurant like a gunshot, silencing every conversation instantly. Maya's cheek stung where Victoria's rings had caught her skin, and she could taste a hint of blood where her lip had caught against her teeth. Time seemed to freeze. Forks stopped midway to mouths. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even the jazz music playing softly overhead seemed to fade away in the shock of the moment. Victoria stood there, her hands still raised, looking somehow both triumphant and surprised at her own actions. Her friends sat in stunned silence, Lisa's face having gone completely pale. Rick had already dropped his towel and was reaching for the phone behind the bar. For a long moment, nobody moved. The entire restaurant held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Victoria's face showed the first flickers of uncertainty as she realized the gravity of what she'd just done. But it was Maya's expression that caught everyone's attention. Instead of shock or fear, her face had taken on a calm, focused look that would have been familiar to anyone who'd served with her in her previous career. As she slowly raised her hand to her cheek, her eyes never leaving Victoria's face, it became clear that this situation was about to take a turn that the wealthy woman had not anticipated. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. As Victoria's hand began to rise for a second strike, Maya's years of military training kicked in automatically. With movements smooth as silk, she caught Victoria's wrist mid-swing, not roughly, but with just enough pressure to stop the motion. Her grip was precise, professional, the result of countless hours of training in handling confrontations without causing harm. The look of shock on Victoria's face was almost comical. Her mouth formed a perfect O as she realized her hand wasn't moving anymore. The three women at her table sat frozen, designer purses clutched in their laps, eyes wide with disbelief. "Mrs. Blackwood," Maya's voice carried clearly across the now silent restaurant, calm and steady as a summer breeze. "I need to inform you that you've just committed assault, which is a criminal offense. For everyone's safety, I'm performing a citizen's arrest until the police arrive." Victoria's face cycled through several emotions: shock, anger, disbelief, and finally, the first hints of fear. You can't do this to me. Do you know who my husband is?" "Actually," Maya replied, maintaining her professional tone, "I do know who your husband is. He's the senior partner at Blackwood and Associates law firm, which means you should understand better than most the seriousness of assaulting someone in front of dozens of witnesses." Throughout the dining room, phones had appeared in diners' hands, recording the scene. An elderly gentleman at a corner table, who turned out to be a retired judge, was already giving his contact information to Rick for when the police arrived. The young woman in the blazer, Lisa, had slid down slightly in her chair, looking like she wished she could disappear entirely. "I've served 6 years in the Marine Corps," Maya continued, her voice still calm but carrying an undercurrent of authority that made everyone listen. "During that time, I learned 2 important things: how to handle hostile situations without escalating them, and how to properly document incidents for legal proceedings." Victoria's designer mascara had started to run slightly as sweat beaded on her forehead. Her other hand clutched her silk scarf like a lifeline. I didn't mean to. It was just. "We already have security camera footage," Maya explained, gesturing with her free hand toward the discrete cameras mounted in the restaurant's corners. "And judging by the number of phones I see, we'll have plenty of witness videos as well. Now I'm going to release your wrist, and I'd appreciate it if you take a seat until the police arrive." The sound of approaching sirens filtered through the restaurant's windows. Someone, probably Rick, had called them the moment Victoria's hand had made contact with Maya's face. Victoria sank into her chair, her earlier bravado completely evaporated. An older couple at a nearby table started applauding softly, which quickly spread throughout the restaurant. Maya raised her hand to quiet them, ever professional. "Please, everyone, let's keep things calm. Return to your meals if you can. The situation is under control." Chef Lee appeared from the kitchen, a fresh steak perfectly cooked to medium rare on a plate. Without a word, he placed it in front of Victoria, who stared at it as if she'd never seen food before. The message was clear. The Golden Fork staff would maintain their professionalism even in the face of poor behavior. "Would anyone like fresh drinks while we wait?" Maya asked the table, as if nothing unusual had happened. Lisa nodded weakly, clearly impressed by Maya's composure. The other 2 women were still too stunned to respond. 2 police officers entered the restaurant, their faces professional but showing hints of surprise at the unusual scene: a high-end dining room full of people calmly eating while a wealthy woman in designer clothes sat crying at her table, a perfectly cooked steak getting cold in front of her. As Maya turned to speak with the officers, she caught her reflection in one of the restaurant's mirrors. There was a small red mark on her cheek where Victoria's rings had caught her, but her uniform was still crisp, her posture straight, and her expression composed. In that moment, she realized that all those years of military service, followed by her law studies, had prepared her perfectly for this exact situation. The police officer's arrival brought a new kind of quiet to the Golden Fork. Officer Chen, no relation to Maya, pulled out his notepad while his partner, Officer Rodriguez, spoke quietly with Rick at the bar, reviewing the security footage on a tablet. The elegant dining room had become an impromptu crime scene, though Maya had managed to keep the atmosphere as calm as possible. "Ma'am?" Officer Chen addressed Victoria, who was still sitting at her table, mascara trails marking her cheeks. "I need to take your statement about what happened here tonight." His tone was professional but firm, making it clear this wasn't a request. Victoria's perfectly manicured hands trembled as she reached for her water glass. This is all a misunderstanding," she stammered, her voice having lost all of its earlier authority. "I was just upset about my meal. I never meant to." to assault your server in front of 30 witnesses. Officer Rodriguez finished, walking over with the tablet. We have quite clear footage of the incident, Mrs. Blackwood. And, she glanced at her notes, 17 different customers have already offered to share their video recordings of the event. At the next table, an elderly couple who'd been celebrating their anniversary spoke up. We've been coming here for 20 years, the gentleman said, his voice carrying the weight of a retired district judge. Never seen anything like this. That young lady, he nodded toward Maya, handled herself with remarkable professionalism. Lisa, still sitting at Victoria's table, seemed to find her courage. I should go on record too, she said quietly, then cleared her throat and spoke more firmly. Victoria has done things like this before. Not usually this bad, but the way she treats service workers. She trailed off as Victoria shot her a venomous look. The other two women at the table, who'd been silent throughout the incident, suddenly became very interested in gathering their belongings. We should go, one murmured, reaching for her purse. But Officer Chen held up his hand. I'm afraid we'll need statements from everyone at the table, he said. Standard procedure in assault cases. The word assault seemed to finally break through Victoria's entitled bubble. Assault? But I'm Victoria Blackwood. My husband's firm handles half the legal cases in this city. Her voice rose in pitch, taking on a desperate edge. Maya, who had been speaking quietly with Chef Lee near the kitchen, walked over. Her cheek still showed a slight red mark, but her demeanor remained completely professional. Mrs. Blackwood, she said calmly, as someone currently attending law school, I should point out that attempting to use your husband's position to influence a police investigation could be seen as attempted obstruction of justice. A few diners who'd been recording everything let out low whistles of appreciation. Victoria's face, already pale, went almost white. You're in law school? Lisa asked, looking at Maya with new respect. Second year, Maya nodded. Specializing in civil rights and workplace law, actually. She turned back to Victoria. Which means I understand exactly how serious this situation is, both criminally and civilly. Officer Rodriguez, who had finished reviewing the security footage, closed her tablet with a decisive click. Mrs. Blackwood, we'll need you to come down to the station to process the assault charge. You can call your lawyer from there. But Victoria looked around desperately, seeking support from her friends, the other diners, anyone. But her usual air of authority had evaporated completely. Her designer clothes and expensive jewelry suddenly seemed less like symbols of power and more like costly decorations on someone who'd just made a very public mistake. Lisa stood up, straightening her blazer. I'll be happy to provide a statement about the pattern of behavior I've witnessed, she said, not looking at Victoria. I should have spoken up sooner about the way you treat people. Throughout the dining room, other regular customers began sharing stories with the officers, tales of previous incidents, of servers reduced to tears, of complaints that had cost people their jobs. Years of unchecked entitled behavior were finally coming to light. Maya watched it all with a calm professionalism that impressed even the veteran police officers. She'd already given her statement, provided first aid documentation of her injury, courtesy of her military training, and helped ensure the other customers could still enjoy their meals despite the disruption. The evening had turned into something none of the regular diners at the Golden Fork would ever forget, the night when someone finally stood up to Victoria Blackwood and did it with such grace and professionalism that it made her behavior look even worse by comparison. The following week at the Golden Fork was unlike any other in the restaurant's history. The incident had gone viral on social media, with millions of views across various platforms. Local news stations had picked up the story, running headlines like "Fine Dining Fiasco" and "Server's Professional Response to Assault Goes Viral." Maya sat in the small courthouse waiting room, her law textbooks open on her lap. She'd been studying between meetings with the district attorney's office, turning this real-world experience into practical learning for her future career. Her professor had even asked her to present the case study to her workplace law class. The courthouse buzzed with activity as Victoria Blackwood's hearing approached. Through the large windows, Maya could see news vans parked outside, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky. The story had struck a chord with people, perhaps because everyone had witnessed or experienced entitled behavior at some point in their lives. "The DA is ready for you," announced a court clerk, leading Maya into a conference room where Victoria and her legal team waited. Victoria looked different today. Her designer clothes were still expensive, but somehow less imposing. Her usual air of superiority had been replaced by something that almost looked like genuine remorse. "Ms. Chen," the district attorney began, "Mrs. Blackwood's legal team has proposed a plea agreement. They've asked that you be present for this discussion, given your law school background and your role as the victim in this case." Maya nodded, remembering her professor's lessons about restorative justice. She'd spent the past week thinking about what outcome would truly serve justice, not just for her, but for all service workers who faced similar treatment. Victoria's lawyer, a sharp-dressed woman in her 50s, spoke first. "My client is willing to plead guilty to misdemeanor assault. She's also prepared to make a substantial donation to a workplace safety organization of Ms. Chen's choosing." And Victoria added, speaking up for the first time, her voice quieter than Maya had ever heard it, "I want to apologize. Not just to you, but to everyone I've treated poorly over the years." She reached into her bag, pulling out a folder. "I've written letters of apology to the servers I got fired. I'm trying to help them find new jobs." The district attorney raised an eyebrow, looking at Maya. "The plea deal would include mandatory anger management classes and community service. Given your status as the victim and your legal background, we'd like your input." Maya thought about Rick the bartender, about Chef Lee, about all the service workers who dealt with difficult customers every day. She thought about her own journey from the military to law school, about justice and redemption. "I have some conditions," Maya said, her voice firm but fair. "First, the community service should be in the service industry, perhaps at a soup kitchen or community cafe. Second, I'd like Mrs. Blackwood to participate in a training program about workplace respect. I know some organizations that provide these services." Victoria's lawyer leaned over to whisper something, but Victoria held up her hand. "I accept those terms," she said. "And I'd like to add something. I want to fund a scholarship for service workers who are pursuing higher education, like you're doing with law school." The district attorney looked impressed. "That's more than generous, Ms. Chen." Maya nodded slowly. "That would help a lot of people who are working hard to build better lives." As they worked out the details, Lisa, Victoria's former friend who'd stood up to her at the restaurant, poked her head into the conference room. She'd been subpoenaed as a witness but had arrived early to show support for Maya. "The news crews want interviews," Lisa announced. "They're calling this a watershed moment for workers' rights in the service industry." Maya shook her head. "No interviews right now. This isn't about public shaming or going viral. It's about making real change." Victoria looked at Maya with what appeared to be genuine respect. "You're going to be an excellent lawyer," she said quietly. "Your clients will be lucky to have someone who understands both justice and mercy." The district attorney finished writing up the agreement, and as everyone signed the necessary papers, Maya felt a sense of satisfaction. This wasn't just about one entitled customer getting consequences for her actions. It was about setting an example, about showing that every person deserves to be treated with dignity, regardless of their job. 1 year later, the Golden Fork looked much the same on the surface. The same elegant chandeliers cast their warm glow over crisp white tablecloths. The same jazz music played softly in the background. Chef Lee still commanded his kitchen with precision and pride. But for those who knew where to look, many things had changed. A framed newspaper article hung near the entrance, its headline reading, "Local Restaurant Leads the Way in Worker Protection." Below it sat a plaque announcing the Golden Fork's new zero-tolerance policy for customer harassment. The restaurant had become a model for others in the industry, with Rick, the veteran bartender, regularly giving talks at other establishments about creating safer workplaces. Maya stood at the host station, adjusting her new blazer, a far cry from her old server's uniform. She now spent her evenings here in a different capacity, running free legal clinics for service industry workers every other Wednesday in the restaurant's private dining room. The Blackwood Service Industry Scholarship Fund, established as part of Victoria's plea agreement, had already helped 12 restaurant workers pursue higher education. "Ready for tonight's session?" Lisa asked, walking in with a stack of handouts. The former member of Victoria's entourage had become one of Maya's strongest allies, using her business background to help service workers understand their rights and negotiate better working conditions. "Just waiting for our guest speaker," Maya replied, checking her watch. The door chimed, and Victoria Blackwood walked in, carrying a leather portfolio. She looked different now, still well-dressed, but her demeanor had changed completely. The entitled anger was gone, replaced by a quiet determination to make amends. "Sorry I'm early," Victoria said, smoothing her skirt. Traffic was lighter than expected. She'd completed her anger management classes months ago, but had chosen to continue attending and even became a peer counselor. Her community service at the local soup kitchen had turned into a regular volunteer position. The private dining room slowly filled with servers, cooks, and other service workers from restaurants across the city. Many came straight from their shifts, still in their work clothes. They were here to learn about their rights, share experiences, and support each other. Chef Lee poked his head in, carrying a tray of appetizers. "A good mind needs good food," he said with a smile, setting down the perfectly arranged plates. The chef had become an outspoken advocate for kitchen staff rights, using his reputation to push for better working conditions throughout the industry. Maya began the session, her law school training evident in her confident presentation style. "Tonight, we're talking about workplace harassment and how to document incidents properly," she explained, passing out materials. "And we have a unique perspective on this topic from our guest speaker." Victoria stood up, her hands slightly shaking, not from anger this time, but from the weight of what she was about to share. "Most of you know who I am," she began. "I was the worst kind of customer. The kind who thought money meant I could treat people however I wanted. I'm here to talk about what I learned about power, respect, and making real changes." The room fell silent as Victoria shared her story. She spoke about her journey through anger management, about confronting her own prejudices, and about the importance of treating every person with dignity. Some of the workers in the audience had dealt with customers just like her, and hearing her perspective and genuine remorse was powerful. Meanwhile, out in the main dining room, Rick was training a new server, emphasizing the restaurant's enhanced policies. "Remember," he said, pointing to the framed article, "this place changed because one person stood up and said enough, and did it the right way." The Golden Fork had become more than just a restaurant. It was a symbol of change. A place where the old rules of the customer is always right had been replaced by a new understanding. That respect and dignity should flow in both directions. As the evening wrapped up, Maya packed her legal books while Victoria helped stack chairs. They worked together comfortably now, their past confrontation transformed into a partnership for positive change. Through the windows, they could see the sunset painting the sky in brilliant colors, a fitting backdrop for a story that had started with conflict but ended with transformation. "You know," Victoria said, pausing by the door, "my friends used to judge restaurants by their wine lists or their celebrity chefs. Now I judge them by how they treat their staff." Maya smiled, remembering that fateful night a year ago. "Sometimes the worst moments can lead to the best changes," she replied, picking up her briefcase. She had a law school exam tomorrow, but tonight's work, helping others stand up for their rights, felt just as important as any test. The incident that had started as a viral video had grown into a movement, proving that one person's stand against injustice could create ripples of change throughout an entire industry. As Maya turned off the lights in the private dining room, she knew that while not every story of workplace harassment would end this way, each small step toward respect and dignity mattered.